Thank you, Julie. All right, before we start, I want to share that for tonight's webinar, you do have the option to listen to the webinar in Spanish and English. If you are on your phone to choose the language that you want to listen to, you can click the More icon at the bottom of your Zoom app, which is represented by the 3 dots. Within that tab, you will find the language interpretation option symbolized by a globe. And once you click it, you will see an option to select for the language that you want. If you select Spanish, you are also able to select mute original audio, so you only hear your chosen language. And if you are on your computer, you should see the language interpretation option right at the bottom of the Zoom, also with a globe to choose your preferred language. Now I'll pass it off to our interpreter, Carolina, to give this instruction in Spanish.
Buenas noches, mi nombre es Carolina, yo seré la intérprete para esta reunión. Vamos a dar las instrucciones cómo puede usted tener acceso a la interpretación en esta reunión antes de empezar. Entonces, si usted está utilizando su teléfono de celular, busque en el menú, la parte de abajo de su pantalla, ahí encontrará el mensaje que dice lenguaje de interpretación, presione ahí. Luego presione en el lenguaje, que sería en español en este caso, y luego puede poner en silencio su audio para asegurarse de que puede escuchar bien el idioma. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
And we will start interpretation. All right, so welcome again. My name is Dira Johanoff, and I'm with the Charles River Watershed Association, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. On the slide here, you will find our agenda. We will be starting with introductions, then go into project overview. You'll get to hear about our last year's flood mitigation plan and some project resources available for you to utilize. Our technical consultant will also share some modeling overview before we go into what's next for us in this grant phase. And then we will end with some time for Q&A from the audience. And while we are presenting, feel free to use the chat function to add your questions for the presenters. I also have my colleagues, Joanna and Lexi, monitoring the chat if people have any issues as well. And before I move on to introduce our organization a little bit, I'd also like to welcome our municipal project lead, Claire Rendelli, with the town of Natick, to give a quick welcome.
Thanks, Dira. Hi, everyone. As Dira said, I'm Claire Rendelli. I'm the conservation agent and environmental planner for the town of Natick, Massachusetts. Natick has had the real honor of being the fiscal lead on this grant project for the entirety of the time that it's been running, I think just over 5 years now. And it has been a really wonderful project, not just for Natick as an individual community, but for the watershed as a whole. The opportunities that this grant has offered to bring communities in the watershed together to talk about this issue that impacts us all as the future of climate change has just been a sort of a shining star when it comes to examples of regional grant projects in the state. Working with CRWA and with Weston Sampson, this project has developed a number of design concepts and projects that are now moving into different stages of implementation. And we're really excited to share with you all the progress that we're hoping to make in this next phase of the project.
Great, thanks, Claire. All right, so for tonight, as we are talking about the project and the work that we are doing in our watershed, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Charles River watershed resides on occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag tribes. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And we acknowledge that a land acknowledgement is not enough, and we continue to grow, learn, and listen to Native voices as we advocate for a resilient future. And if you're not familiar with Charles River Watershed Association or CRWA, we are an environmental advocacy organization formed in 1965. Our mission today is to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River and its watershed through science, advocacy, and the law. And when we say watershed, we are talking about that area of land where rain falls on that land and will flow and end up in a common body of water, which in our case is the Charles River. And you can see a map of the watershed on the screen, as well as some details about the watershed and the river itself. And as an organization, we do take a watershed scale view on everything that happens in the watershed, especially when it comes to flooding, because what happens upstream in a watershed doesn't stay upstream. So there's a lot of collaboration happening in our watershed. All right, so now I'd like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Our first speaker will be Julie Wood, who is the Climate Resilience Director at CRWA. She manages the Charles River Climate Compact and serves as the project manager for the Charles River Flood Model Project, both of which you'll be hearing about tonight. And then we'll hear from our technical consultants, Indrani Ghosh, who is the senior technical lead for Weston Sampson. Indrani has more than 14 years of experience as a water resources engineer and as a technical lead in climate change resiliency projects. Then we'll also hear from Jenny Moonen, who is the Senior Project Manager and Engineering Team Leader with Weston & Sampson. She is a Massachusetts registered professional engineer with over 18 years of experience working with communities of all sizes across New England to provide drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater services. And last but not least, we also hear from Lee Munier, who is the program manager at Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CRWA. And she has been with them since 2018, both as an organizer for their annual Climate Interface Summit and a member of the local CRWA chapter in Somerville. Lee has been with her team coordinating much of the community engagement work related to the Charles River Flood Model Project. And so you'll be hearing from her tonight about some of the work we've been doing in the past and what we're doing in this next phase. And with that, I will pass it off to Julie.
Thank you so much, Dira. And thanks to all of you who are taking time out of your evening to join us tonight to hear about this project. We hope you find it informative. Please feel free to jot down your questions in the chat, as Dira said, because we want to make sure everybody leaves with the answers they're looking for and hopefully learn something tonight. So just starting off, climate change, it's a big topic. It isn't coming, it's here. We're all see it in our daily lives, experience it, and then of course can't miss it in the headlines either. So while this project has been going on for many years and we've learned a lot, there's always external factors changing that also influence our work and influence the reality. And of course, the new administration coming in this month is one of those big ones. This project is partially federally funded, and I will just be honest, we had a bit of a scare earlier this week that some of this work may not be able to continue. Knock wood. Now it seems to be resolved for now, and we're going to continue doing what we're doing. And I think Claire say glimmer of hope that this project can provide. That's what I see in this work, that our local municipal partners, our local governments are really stepping up here in a area that we're in now with a lack of federal leadership. And so all the work you're going to hear about tonight is really being driven by local governments, local municipal leaders coming together to advance work that they can't necessarily do alone, but really needs to be done. Next slide. So we're focused on precipitation-based flooding that is caused by rainfall, essentially, not so much flooding that is caused by sea level rise or high tides. And this is particularly concerning because storms are getting stronger, larger storms are becoming much more frequent, And with those larger storms, we get more flooding. Just a few inches of rainfall all across the watershed can increase the volume of water in the river by millions of gallons. So just these small increases coming down that entire 308 square mile watershed can make a big difference on the downstream impacts. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this project involves a partnership of local governments. We call our partnership the Charles River Climate Compact. The group was founded in 2019, and it includes 28 of the 35 cities and towns in our watershed. Local municipalities, as I said, were really willing and eager to step up to protect their residents, but they also realized they couldn't do it all alone. Climate change is a problem, of course, at a global scale. These impacts do not respect political boundaries. And when you're talking about flooding, that is absolutely true. As Dira showed, the watershed, which includes all of 35 cities and towns, being impacted by what comes downstream, what comes from upstream to downstream. There's our mission statement, primarily focused on building resilience through the use of nature-based solutions. Next slide. One of the very first things the Climate Compact did when we were founded back in, this dates back to about 2020, was to start looking more deeply into flooding and understanding the impacts of future flooding. To do that, we partnered with Weston and Sampson Engineering to develop the Charles River flood model. They're going to talk a little bit more, well, a good deal more about the technical aspects and what we've learned to date. So I'll just say briefly, this is essentially a computer model of the watershed that lets us have a better understanding of what happens in different rainfall scenarios. Other partners on the team are CRWA, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, and you'll get to hear from Lee a little bit later. And then the 21 cities and towns listed there on the right. And if your community is not involved, it could have been that they were involved in a previous round. We've had some folks come and go in the last 4 years, or it could be that they will be involved in the next round. We're always looking for more partners. Next slide. We, of course, want to thank our funders. The state's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program has funded this work from the very beginning. We're very grateful for their support. And as I mentioned, part of it is federal funding through a community project funding from Representative Catherine Clark's office. Next slide. So we keep talking about the watershed, the importance of the watershed. It really is a watershed approach that we're taking with this project. What the watershed is defined by is the fact that if rain falls on this watershed, it's going to end up in the Charles River. So watershed is a definition of water movement. And when you're talking about flooding, that's essentially what you're talking about. Where is water moving? When is it going to get there? And where is it going to end up? So looking at flooding in any other context than the watershed really means you're not looking at the complete picture. When we do look at the watershed, we have more tools in our toolbox. So in the headwaters or the top of our watershed, we can look at opportunities to store water, hold it in place so that it doesn't end up downstream and cause flooding. In the middle watershed, we look at some opportunities to store and then possibly opportunities to move the water quickly when we need to. And then when you're a downstream area or a confluence area, you can move the water quickly. You can also start to think about retreating out of flood-prone areas or protecting buildings that are in flood-prone areas. Next slide. We have been working on this project since 2020. That's when we found out about our initial funding. And we're going to recap a little bit and point you to some resources today, but we're not going to dive all the way back into the beginning. But just to kind of hit on the highlights, back in 2021, we developed our first version of the Charles River flood model. Having that flood model allowed us to run a lot of different rainfall scenarios through the model, including future climate-induced rainfall scenarios. So back in 2021, for the very first time, we were able to provide our partner cities and towns with what it might look like for flooding in your community under future climate rainfall scenarios. This is really just basic critical information that we need for smart decision making. And as I said, we'll be getting into the details, but we're looking at 2070 storms, future storms, 50 years out or so. We're making decisions right now about infrastructure that has a life that long or longer. Think about some of our infrastructure in Boston. It's been with us for over 100 years. As we put infrastructure in the ground now, as we build things now, these things are going to be here decades into the future as our climate goes through these inevitable changes. So we need that information to make smart decisions now to be ready for the future. In 2022, we published our very first flood mitigation plan. In 2023, we really, that's when we started really making a transition into solutions. That's where our project lies now, and you'll hear a lot tonight about solutions we looked at, solutions we're going to look at. So since 2023, we've really been delving into solutions and trying to understand what can we do to mitigate the impacts of this climate-induced flooding? What can we do to make it better? What can we do to protect ourselves, protect our infrastructure, protect our residents? So in 2024, that actually led to an update of our flood mitigation plan. The updated flood mitigation plan is available on our website. We put that out this past June. So please take a look. That will have a lot more information than we'll be able to provide to you tonight. Next slide. So we've all been using this word flooding quite a bit. What is it? Is flooding natural? And flooding certainly is a natural occurrence. That's why rivers have floodplains, because in nature there are times of drought and there are times of abundant water. And nature has built systems to adapt to those different sides of the spectrum. Our built infrastructure is not flexible. Our built infrastructure is not adaptable. So our built infrastructure comes into conflict in times of drought and in times of overabundance of water or flooding. So that's really what we're talking about, the intersection of our built environment and these rain occurrences that are outside of the norm, although becoming much more common. So at the start, or actually I should say it was about midway through the project, we really had to dig into this a bit more and define what is reasonable for us to address when it comes to flooding, what should be our goals for protection. And so these are our defined goals that we've been working on for the last few years. That future flooding does not impact critical infrastructure. So these are things like our police stations, our fire stations, our hospitals, our schools. So let's make sure we're protecting those. We're also working to prevent flooding in environmental justice communities or other climate vulnerable residents, communities that maybe do not have the resources to self-adapt as easily or to relocate. And finally, future flooding is no worse than the present day flooding as our climate changes. So if we accept flooding we may experience today as a given, we don't want to let that get any worse. Next slide. So I referenced the fact that we've been going at this for a while and have developed a lot of resources. I'm just going to put a plug in for those to please check them out. Everything is accessible from the website you see on the left side of your screen there, the crwa.org/watershed-model. Lot of info, lot of links. I also want to highlight the story maps we've put together. These are wonderful scroll through visual interactive story maps that again link from our website that let you learn a lot through, as I said, through pictures and short paragraphs. One of the ones we put out recently focuses on all the site-specific solutions we've identified, some of which are, I am sure, in communities that folks on the call tonight live in. So please check that out. You might find that we've actually done some initial solution identification work in your community, and we'd love you to know more about those projects. Next slide. Our pride and joy, perhaps, is our data viewer. From the very beginning of the project, an important goal was data democracy. Just putting this basic information out and making it available to everyone. So from the very beginning, we've put all our flood modeling results on the web in this interactive viewer for anyone to look at. You can scroll around, you can type in an address, you can explore different scenarios. The one we have up here, you can see in the legend on the left, is the future 100-year storm. So the 100-year or 1% chance of occurring in any year storm that we project will be occurring in 2070. So that 50-year out storm. Next slide. All right, and I will wrap up here. These are the recommendations that came out of our latest round of modeling, which Indrani's gonna recap the details on that for you. But this is essentially kind of big picture what we're focusing on now, again, as we transition more into that solution-based mindset. So our recommendations, strong stormwater regulations. Most stormwater regulations right now are focused on water quality. And of course, as a river advocate, I love that. I embrace that. I cheer for that. But we also need to think about flooding and where are the opportunities to also address flooding while we're thinking about water quality. What's the big difference? The big difference is how much water you're thinking about dealing with, essentially. If you want to fix water quality issues in stormwater, you can look at a 1-inch storm. If you want to fix flooding issues from stormwater, you have to look at more of an 8-inch storm. So it's a bit of a gap there, a bit of a mindset shift. And so we're really trying to recommend that folks think about flooding when they're thinking about their stormwater recommendations. Take broad and aggressive actions. This is not an easy fix. We're not going to pretend it is. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of investment. So we need to, again, have a mindset shift a bit to think about how we can more aggressively address our flooding issues. Use a science-based approach, implement solutions where they are most effective. That's one thing that having the model as a tool lets us understand. How can we match the best solution with the best site? So we're extremely lucky that we've been able to invest in this model and gain some understanding in that. Work with residents to identify and implement projects. Some of those site-specific projects that you'll see when you check out our story map were brought to us by residents. And that's great. That's great. If residents are already embracing something and working on something that might also have flood benefits, that's a win-win. This is something CRWA is working on, exploring regional governance structures. While this informal partnership has gotten us very far, it may not get us all the way we need to go. So perhaps we need some more formal regional governance structures here in Massachusetts. That's something we've been exploring at Charles River Watershed Association. And start taking action now. 2070 may seem far away. I'm sure it does probably for a lot of us. But again, the scale of adaptation that's needed means we really need to start acting now. We need to start acting now so that we are ready when those storms come. And I saw a chat question pop up. What is the Watertown rule? Great question. No, I did not explain that. The Watertown rule is an ambitious stormwater regulation that the town of Watertown has in place, which requires new development and redevelopment projects to store the 100-year storm on their own site. So that means they're not letting that water go into the municipal system. They're not letting that water go off site. They're not letting that water go downstream. It's being held on site. Adds a lot of storage into the city, essentially. Okay, and I believe that's my last slide. Yep, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Andrani.
Thanks a lot, Julie. I will share my screen. Full screen here. Can you all see my screen? Thank you. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction that essentially you recapped our 5 years of work in those few minutes, and it has certainly taken all of you and more that we're seeing on the call today to bring together this project. It's taken a watershed to develop what we have done, and we very much appreciate the contributions that we have received from the project steering committee, the municipalities, and certainly the project partners here. Just a very quick recap of the technical work that has been accomplished to date. Julie has covered quite a bit of this, so I will be brief and pointed in my remarks here, but it really sort of shows the extent of the flood model. This map here shows the extent of the integrated flood model, and we call it the integrated flood model because it integrates riverine flooding along with flooding that we see in our stormwater and piped infrastructure, and it brings it together so we can see essentially a model. This is a hydrologic hydraulic model, which if you can think of it, it essentially traces the journey of a raindrop when it falls from the sky to when it ultimately finds its way to the Charles River, as Julie explained. And then the model sort of simulates the runoff that is expected to see across the watershed, and where we're going to see the flooding and how much more flooding, what is the duration of the flooding. Those are the answers that we can get from an integrated flood model that is a hydrologic hydraulic flood model. So this project covered the upper and the middle Charles River watershed, which is essentially all the way upstream from the Watertown dam to the headwaters of the Charles, and that is the over 270 square miles. We looked at over 1.28 million linear feet of dams, culverts, and bridges. To understand the runoff processes, we broke up the entire watershed into smaller units or subcatchments to better understand that rainfall runoff response approach. And we represented the ponds and the lakes as storage areas. We looked at manholes and catch basins and junctions, manholes and catch basins as junctions in the watershed. And as you can see here, and Julie covered this, we started developing this during the helm of COVID in 2020, and we continue to update the model. We think that this is not shouldn't be a shelved model. It should be a living model that gets updated with best available data, and that's what this project has been able to achieve. The model is as good as the data that gets into the model. So what we have done as part of this effort is we have used existing USGS gauges to calibrate the model, which essentially says how well the model or the simulated results of flooding compare with observed flooding that has been observed in the watershed. So we've looked at rain events that have caused significant flooding in the watershed, such as the March 2010 storm. We have calibrated this model to these 5 locations that you can see on the map here that correspond to USGS gauge locations. After the model was calibrated, we have validated that model with more recent storm events. We looked at the storm in 2018 of April. We've also looked at the storm that is more recent. Some of you may remember Hurricane Ida, which happened in September of 2021. So we've been able to validate the model results, and we're happy to report that with all of the with incremental improvements that we've made to the model over the course of this project, we're now really able, the model simulates observed conditions in terms of flow and volume, as well as extensive flooding, pretty accurately. Julie covered this in an earlier slide, but it was really the charge of this project, and the charge on the technical team was to understand really how much more flooding this watershed is likely to experience. So with that, it implies that we would need to look at future climate change projections. We looked at the climate change projections as best available data that has been adopted by the state of Massachusetts. So we looked at the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, or the RMAT tool, as it is popularly called. And really, many of you have seen the findings of these rainfall projections, and Julie presented it as well, but it's really an intensification of frequency and intensity that we are likely to experience. So for example, the 25-year storm of today is likely to be the 10-year storm by 2050. And the 100-year storm of today is likely to be the 10-year storm by 2070. So or the 25-year storm by 2070, excuse me. So it was really a lot more flooding we are likely to experience in the future, and we're likely to experience more frequent storms in the future. Once we have the model that has been developed, that rainfall can now be converted into acres of flooding. That rainfall can be converted into volumes of flooding. So this slide here shows how much additional areas of the watershed are likely to be flooded from these future storms. These storms are called the design storms. So a 2-year storm is a storm that has a 50% chance of occurring in any given year. A 100-year storm, on the other hand, is a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And we use the 10-year storm and as one of the benchmarks, and we'll come to that in a later slide, but as a reference, a 10-year storm is a fairly frequent, but it also is a storm that dumps a lot of rain. A 10-year storm by 2070 is likely to result in over 5,800 million gallons of additional runoff volume. And Julie mentioned this earlier. This sort of points to the fact that how much additional flood volume would the communities need to manage as a result of these increasing rainfall events of increasing intensity and frequency that we're likely to see in the future. And that is an enormous amount of additional flood volume that would need to be managed. What that means in terms of acreage of area, there is likely to be close to 1,400 acres of additional area that will be flooded for that same 10-year storm by 2070 compared to the present, and that would result in potentially areas of environmental justice population groups, climate vulnerable population groups, and critical facilities being impacted as a result of this flooding if we take no action. So all of these are showing what happens if no action is taken, infrastructure and conditions exist as they are today in the watershed, and how much more flooding would you all have to manage and deal with. So with that, we looked at a slew of watershed scale flood reduction strategies. And as Julie mentioned, we've learned from every phase, we've learned what can be done to improve upon that. So these were some of the initial strategies that we looked at, which ranged in seeing how much, if 50% of impervious cover were to store the 2-year storm, what would that look like in terms of flood reduction? What would it look like if there were additional storage across ponds in the watershed? What would be if additional wetlands provided more storage? And we looked at these slew of strategies we evaluated through phases 1 and 2 of the project. But what was really startling to us when we looked at it and we compared it with one of the goals that Julie mentioned earlier on, is to make the future flooding no worse than it is today. Which essentially, so this green bar here, the first bar on the left, the green bar is the 10-year storm of today. And assuming that we can live with the 10-year storm of today, that we can manage or handle the 10-year storm of today, we wouldn't want the 10-year storm of the future to get any worse than the 10-year storm of today. If we do nothing, the 10-year storm by 2070 gets that much more worse, which is represented by the second column here in darker blue. And then when we tested all of those watershed scales flood reduction strategies that I mentioned in the previous slide, we saw that none of those strategies were getting close to bridging that gap that we see between the present day 10-year storm and the future 10-year storm with no action. Some of them are getting better, but they're not nearly doing what needs to be accomplished to achieve that goal that Julie mentioned was the goal of this project. We did find that storing the 2-year storm by 2070 with half of the impervious cover in the watershed leads to the greatest reduction in flooding. So what the flood model also enabled us to, what also provided us was an in-depth understanding of where the flooding is occurring, what the peaks, where the peakiness of the flooding is, how much does it peak where are the flashy parts of the watershed that when rain occurs, immediately we see a response to increasing in flooding that represents as increased flooding on your streets or increased flooding to your critical infrastructure. And we're seeing that there is variability across the watershed in how different portions of the watershed are responding to those different types of storm events. And that really encouraged us to better understand and tailor the solutions so that if the different portions of the watershed are reacting to the rainfall events in different way, that gave us that told us that the solutions that we need to come up with need to be different from one portion of the watershed to the other. If there is an upstream portion, and Julie covered that as well, if there are upstream portions of the watershed, do those need to be targeted more for storage? And that really helped us understand, the model helped us understand what types of solution can work where most effectively in the watershed. And those were the targeted solutions that we looked at in the last 2 phases, particularly in the last phase of this project. And we sort of categorized the targeted solutions into 3 broad categories of, one, what types of solutions would reduce effective impervious area? That could be pervious pavement, that could be depaving, infiltrating catch basins. What could we do to create more pervious storage, more storage underneath existing pervious areas? So if we have an existing pervious area, could we potentially think of converting that to a constructed wetland, engineer it to be a floodable park, or even have an existing reservoir be drawn down in advance of a storm to create more storage? And then what could we do to increase storage underneath existing impervious areas, such as parking lots? Could we have subsurface infiltration chambers, more green infrastructure along the right-of-way, along the roads? And when we looked at, so there were 3 broad categories of these targeted solutions that we looked at. One of them Julie has mentioned is the Watertown Rule. And that Watertown Rule was essentially a stringent approach of what it would take to make stormwater policy more stringent. It was a more stringent stormwater policy applied to new development and redevelopment parcels. And it's called the Watertown Rule because the city of Watertown has implemented that effectively as one of its stormwater policies. And we wanted to test what would that yield if that were to be implemented at a watershed scale. And so that was storing the over 8 inches of rain from the 100-year storm of today. Actually, that 8 inches corresponds to the 100-year storm of today on new development and redevelopment parcels. We also then looked at, so that was our scenario 1. Scenario 2 was targeting catchments with the top 2 solutions that we identified would be most effective in that location, which was a combination of either reducing impervious cover and creating more storage underneath impervious cover, or if we were to reduce impervious cover and create more storage in pervious spaces. So that was our scenario 2. So we doubled up solutions there. And then in scenario 3, we looked at what if we pick the single best solution, and we do that throughout the watershed. So scenario 2, we picked certain catchments that showed more responsiveness to those strategies. And then in scenario 3, we picked the best solution out of reducing impervious cover, creating more storage underneath pervious, or creating storage underneath impervious cover. And that was implemented throughout the watershed. When we tested that out through the model, we found really promising and interesting results. So that goal that we had, that we talked about, making the future storm no worse than the present day storm, the Watertown Rule was able to achieve that. So it was awakening for us to see that there are communities such as Watertown, which has implemented aggressive local stormwater policies, but those policies, if implemented across the watershed, can be effective in mitigating the effects of climate change and can address the challenges, can address this increasing flooding issues. However, implementing a policy as stringent as that comes with challenges that comes with implementing that, and that is the key issue that we would need to solve for collectively. And that the targeted approach also gave us the ability to understand that significant mitigation is possible, but it is not really an or, it is an and. We need to do a combination of solutions, and when they're done to the right extent, can be really effective in reducing flooding in the watershed and could achieve that goal. And we saw a significant level of flood reduction to the extent of approximately 50 to 70% in flood reduction for the 10-year storm of the future. The other goal that we evaluated that we were effective in meeting with some of these more stringent solutions was the impact to critical facilities, as Julie mentioned. So there was a significant increase in critical facilities being impacted under the future storm if no action was taken. However, with those targeted solutions, such as the more stringent Watertown Rule and the other solutions, we were able to mitigate that impact on critical facilities, and we were able to achieve the goal that we set out with. And with that, I will turn it over to Jenny to speak about some of the additional gray-green opportunities that we are evaluating as part of this current phase that we're working on.
Yeah, we've used this information in the past phases to look, as Julie mentioned, to targeted areas of the watershed and specific priority projects. And this year, what we're doing is we're looking at 2 areas that we identified based on that sort of targeted solutions analysis that Indrani talked about. And we're evaluating gray, green, and gray plus green infrastructure and running it through the model. And I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page here. Gray infrastructure, right? This is what you would think of when you think of stormwater management. It's the catch basins, the pipes, the manholes, and the outfalls in the road. Green infrastructure is practices that you may see in your community or be aware of, but these are areas that filter, infiltrate, and create evapotranspiration to sort of soak up rain where it falls. It also has other co-benefits, right? It reduces urban heat, it creates mental health benefits, it can create placemaking, etc. And then there are ways to combine these two, which we're calling gray plus green. Some examples just for folks to see on their screen, catch basins, like we talked about, pipes, outfalls, culverts, and even underground storage systems, which is the image in the bottom right. And then when you think of green infrastructure, right, this image on the upper left is what's called maybe a rain garden or bioretention. The image on the bottom left is a planting project where we were planting a great rain garden. And the image on the right has some permeable pavement, right? So a gray solution, as well as swales that are planted as a green solution. And here's a great example of a gray plus green project. The image on the left is a picture of construction in the city of Lynn. And those black crates you see there, those are what are called R tanks. They're effectively, like, imagine a milk crate from days past. They're structurally sound, but they create all this volume for water to be in underground. And they're like a flood storage way to put water underground, put it back into the ground, or even just retain it before it can overflow back into that traditional gray system. And you can tie that into a green solution. Look at the middle image. You can see this is a bioretention swale, but it has an overflow that puts water into the underground system as well. So you get both quality and quantity reduction. And the image on the right is what this looks like during a heavy rain event. So we're looking at two targeted catchments. One is in Dedham, and that's outlined in blue. And one is in Norfolk, and that is outlined in pink. And you can see on this map where they are in the watershed. In Dedham, this is almost 3,000 acres of area. 810 of that is impervious cover. So it's about 30% impervious, 7.2 miles of stream. So reasonably wet, if you will, along, 95, 128. And then in Norfolk, 2,200 total acres, only 200 acres of impervious, just under 10% impervious cover, and a similar amount of stream system. So reasonably more wet than Dedham. And we'll just explain it as an example what we're doing this year. We're looking, we're really honing in and looking at, okay, we have this targeted solution. We know how much volume we have to mitigate to offset that potential future amount of precipitation, right? So how can we keep it from being worse than it is now? How can we minimize additional impacts to critical infrastructure? And we've done a screening and come up with 7 locations for bioretention basins, which are like, rain gardens, a number of locations for subsurface infiltration, quite a few locations where you could put bioretention along the road. Those were like images I just showed of the city of Lynn, where you see, the granite curb, but there is a planting area. Quite a few areas that could be depaved, right? So less parking. There's quite a lot of parking available, and number of places where we can actually infiltrate water through sort of a larger basin system. So those are dispersed through the watershed, and we're in the process of evaluating how much water those can hold back and running those through the model. And then we're also, if you look in the next slide, looking at a combination of gray opportunities. And a lot of the work we've done over the past 5 years really has been focused on green solutions. And we've heard from the communities that are in the partnership that they also want to think about, okay, well, what are also some of the practical solutions here that we might think about as more traditional engineering solutions? So what modifying catch basins, right? So those are the grates you see in the road. What if there are places that have not just one, but two of them, and they go into the pipe, and it makes a way for significantly more water to get into the system? What if you upsize your storm drains and make them larger? Can you convey more water? What if you divert your drainage that's flooding in one area and maybe add a pipe that goes to another area? Or what if you put storage or places to hold back water? So that's part of, and again, this map on the left is just showing the extent of the built drainage system in Dedham, but that's public, not the private. There's quite a bit of private drainage as well, but we're looking at all of those little areas, and that's going to go through the model as well. So that's the exercise this year, is that sort of analysis and evaluation. And with that, I think we're turning it back to Julie.
Thank you guys so much. All right, excellent. Yes, we are transitioning our screen back. And our next speaker is Lee Munier. Go ahead, Lee.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. And I think I first want to just say I'm so excited for Norfolk with 10% impervious. I live in Somerville, and we are, I believe, 78% impervious. But it's also exciting to hear in the event this evening about all of the depaving and the commitments to removing a lot of that pavement. So just excited for that. And I think, I think that's actually a great example of why it's so important to be out talking with community members, right? Across the watershed. Not only is the watershed geographically changing, but every community is very different, and the solutions are going to be very different as well. So first, I just want to briefly introduce us. So we are CRWA, for those who are coming to this project, to the flood model, and this is your first time touching this project. CRWA has been involved since the early days that Julie mentioned, 2021. And so we are, I really appreciate Claire's framing of very honored to be not only a part of this project because of the project itself, the model, but also because it is an honor to be out in communities, to be trusted, to get out there and talk with people, right? And hear what the insights are, the experiences are, the needs are in communities. And so with CRWA, Communities Respond to Extreme Weather, we are very intentionally named that because even if the people in communities don't necessarily all believe in climate change or are disinterested in climate change and the way it's influencing flooding and other extreme weather, it's still happening. And so it is important for our communities and for groups like us, like CRWA, to show up for people and with people and help people prepare regardless. So that's us, that's CRWA. With this project, we are very excited to be the leads in doing a lot of the community engagement. And that includes me and Alexi, who was mentioned earlier, who's helping document what's being shared tonight. And yeah, so we'll jump in here and maybe to the next slide and show you some of the things that we are going to be doing in this phase. So a lot of the early stages were, as Julie mentioned, 2021 was when we were in the throes of COVID. So much connection then was virtual. And then over a couple of years, we started to kind of slowly emerge with communities, move at the speed of communities, and would engage with people mainly in watershed events and festivals. And then over the last year or so, and then coming into this current phase, a lot of the work is now offering us an opportunity to have more intimate dialogues with people, right? As it's safer and healthier in some ways for people to be able to reconnect indoors for longer periods of time. It means that we have the space to really lean in and have more longer dialogues and more intimate connections with people. So while we are still doing the watershed events and festivals, as you can see, we will be, this phase actually started a few months ago. And so up through June, we will be out in communities at different events, festivals, farmers markets, and in those spaces, we'll be talking with people about flooding in your communities, offering ways that you can be prepared. That's one of CRWA's specialties. And then letting people know where they can go for more information, whether that's about preparing at home or in your community, or if you have ideas, right, for those nature-based solutions that Julie mentioned are integral to this project, right? A lot of it, those ideas come from y'all. While we're out at these community events, we are noticing a deep desire for more direct community connection. And so therefore we are engaging in what we're calling workshops. Workshops is really just a catch-all phrase, but really can be socials, parties, retreats, gatherings, kind of however is the way in, I think, for community, whoever we're connecting with. So we'll also be in communities across the watershed, especially CRCC is just the climate compact, also created with CRWA. So we will be continuing to organize workshops across. The additional things that we'll be doing in these workshops are having more focused dialogues on some of those flood mitigation solutions existing, right? So this is an opportunity for city staff, for members of CRWA, and also neighboring watershed groups to come and join us to talk with and get feedback from community members about existing nature-based projects that are related to the flood model and otherwise, and then also to collect ideas for potential projects. And then again, where CRWA, again, it feels skilled, and where I find a lot of joy is also engaging people in direct community building and climate resilience activities as well, which I'll talk a little bit more. Next slide. So yeah, so as mentioned, this is an ongoing project. So there's opportunities for us to continue to return to places. That's really important to us. And that's in the shape of workshops, continuing to do workshops, a 2.0, going back again and again with each phase, and also showing up at some of those same festivals and markets, farmers markets, et cetera, because that's how we build trust, right? Is to show up over and over again, and people see you there in the community, sharing information. Some of it's the same and some of it's updated, right? I do want to just lift up like one of those places that I want to celebrate that's been a real impact of returning, are places like Newton. We've gone back to Newton Earth Fest in April every year. I think we've been 3 years now, and we intend to go back again this year. And that's just been an invaluable experience, both for us and I think and community members. Here's a photo of Anna, who's an interpreter who has joined us. The first year we went, we didn't know, that we were going to miss engaging with so many people because we needed someone who could interpret in Mandarin and Cantonese, right? So the next couple of years, we've been able to really reach people in ways that are really meaningful to them by returning. So, and that, like I said, is also in connection with some of the workshops that we're going to do, and then also thinking about our partnerships, and also with some of our materials, utilizing some of those same materials that we've just found continuously engaging and successful in reaching people. Things like our multilingual posters that reach kids, and also thinking about the new, right? So Harvest Fest is in Franklin. That's a new place we're going to get to. Excited to reach out to some more senior centers in this phase. And then also excited about some of our partnerships that are new. Arlington Housing Authority, just want to lift them up, because what's really cool about some of the new partnerships is that Arlington Housing Authority, as an example, is interested not only in doing one event, but taking what we did at an event with them and expanding on it, right? And replicating it with other housing developments. So those are the kinds of partnerships we're especially interested in, because then that has expanded reach and impact. Next slide. So yeah, so just a quick on workshops are key. Obviously, it's really great to be able to go to festivals and table and catch people in passing. But workshops are where we really get to slow down, right? And have some spaciousness, meet people where they are, go to where they are literally, right? Their physical place, which is where people are going to care about the most, their homes. I'm going to come back to housing developments again, right? We definitely want to be out doing workshops there, because a lot of the housing developments are located in vulnerable places geographically. They're right on the waterways. Another, just want to lift up too, we're also excited to be out, hopefully in this phase, reaching out to houses of worship, again, for that same reason as with Arlington Housing Authority, one house of worship has relationships with other houses of worship in their same denomination. So if we are able to reach one, we can reach many. And with political committees, that's also an opportunity for us to build bridges, right? What we find over and over again is political affiliation does not matter when it comes to clean water, clean air, caring about pollinators. So we just want to make sure we're out connecting with people in that way as well. And then the last thing I'll name on here is just why workshops are key too, which is an opportunity for city and town staff to come join us. So we always committed everywhere we go to invite key city and town staff to come, and they can listen to and learn from residents directly, names with faces, build trust, and be able to share directly and get feedback on those nature-based solution projects that were already mentioned. Next slide. So within our workshops, it's just, what are we committed to here? Where, in addition to the content, the other two C words that we get excited about are creativity and connection. What we keep hearing over and over again and witnessing are things like COVID. It's not just, us making sure we're safe and healthy because of COVID, but COVID has had a real impact on culture, right? On the way people's brains are shaped. When you have crises like COVID or some of these extreme weather crises, they could have impacts that are long lasting, and they actually change how people behave and how people think and how they relate. So those are that's one thing that we're thinking about. I also want to lift up the importance of honoring emotions and experiences. So in our outreach, as a lot of this work can get heavy, right? Some of the conversations we have, and people are sharing some experiences that maybe, as much as we don't want to cause harm, we don't know what people are going to share. It might be something, a past trauma. But in sharing that trauma or sharing some of that wisdom, right, past flooding and events, people also can learn from each other. The last couple of things I just want to lift up here on this slide are, really thinking about the ways that we are framing our conversations around preparedness. I found it really effective to talk about things in terms of preciousness. What's precious to us, the place that we are living in, the places we're witnessing change, the belongings that will get lost or destroyed in a flood that we want to protect and make sure we take with us when we have to leave. And again, and just as Carolina is here tonight, this commitment again to really having authentic connection, and the way to do that is through language support as well. So through translation, interpretation. So thank you, Carolina. Next slide. So just want to let people know, again, just same as with the tabling events, workshops have begun. We just had our first one of this phase last week. That was over at Drake Village Apartments, one of the housing developments that I mentioned, which is located on the Millbrook in Arlington. That was a multilingual event, and just they shared some really powerful insights, specific concerns that they raised around increasing and things that are of concern, and a decrease in what we want, right? More pollinators and wildlife, and that's what's going away. And residents are deeply concerned about the impacts of extreme weather. And also, what gave people a lot of hope, I just wanted to highlight, they were excited that we were there, that people are doing something about it. So whether people get actively involved or not, it's just this is the space where, workshops are the space where we can explain things in a way where people might have more desire to get involved. But even if they don't, we've been there with them, and they're seeing that people are doing something about it. And I've just seen directly how much that gives people a sense of relief and safety and hope. And lastly is just reach out. So if you have ideas, right? Are you interested in a workshop in your community? Are you interested in having us come to table? Are there, I think we need to maybe add 1 or 2 more tabling events too. So if there's a place that you're thinking, wow, you would really reach a lot of people in a meaningful way, let us know. And Crew's always here to partner in other ways too. So don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you. And I'll pass it back to my dear friend, Julie.
Yes, thank you so much, Lee. And this is our last slide of the evening. We're wrapping up, and then we'll transition into our questions. Good to see we already have some questions. So just wanted to leave you with what's next, what's coming. Jenny previewed a lot of the design work. Lee previewed a lot of the outreach work that we'll be taking on in the next few months. So just to put a bow on that, we are generating more site-specific flood mitigation solutions. We are, as I said, we're in our solutions era. So we're really leaning into that in this phase of the work, finding these ideas because we need a lot of them and we need to start doing them. As Jenny already highlighted, we're expanding somewhat to include gray solutions. That was feedback, as Jenny mentioned, from our partners, but also from the public. We heard from the public, hey, look at everything. You know, we had really been leaning into nature-based solutions, and that continues to be where we primarily lean into. But we're looking at everything. We really want to solve this problem in the most effective way. And Lee really went into this about fostering more in-depth conversations through workshops. We're so excited about that. And then we're just going to be continuing to share our findings, continuing to get the word out about this work with residents and interested people. So that's part of what tonight was all about. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it back to Dira to facilitate our Q&A. Yes, we are welcoming live questions and chat questions, I believe.
Yes, so thank you to all of our speakers. We have a bit of time for our Q&A. So if you haven't already, please feel free to put in the chat your questions or raise your hand if you want to verbally ask your questions, and I will have our speakers answer your curious ones. All right, let's start with so the hands up. Ellen, I know you had your hand up for a while. You should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, and I apologize I was late. I've been in back-to-back meetings all day. I was really inspired by some of the stuff with crew Lee, and I think we're actually even one of those hubs, but I do have one request of you, and that you make sure that you have Zoom available stuff for those of us who are health challenged and can't be in spaces with other folks. We need the community on Zoom, so I'll just make that suggestion. So I'll just make a quick comment and then ask some questions. So I went through 3 climate catastrophic floods in less than 5 months. I live in Needham Heights.
Oh. Sorry, you somehow muted.
Okay, it's all right. So I was just going to say I went through 3 climate catastrophic floods in less than 5 months. I live in Needham Heights. And it wasn't just me, it was 250 plus homes and businesses in my community. And how my community handled it is that for a while we pretended we were going for FEMA money, and they did absolutely this to help the residents, like nothing. They were supposed to be meeting with people on a neighborhood basis. They never came to my neighborhood. And what surprised me so much is reaching out to the town officials, of whom I reached out to many, and people working for the town. Oh, we should call the Red Cross. We should, like, why would you think that? And I even had one woman like saying the same thing. I'm like, so why would you not think that in a natural disaster, and some people had like 6 feet of water in their houses, why would you think in a natural disaster that you don't expect your town officials to actually do something? So then we realized how much we needed to, coalesce on our own. Many of us who are in this group are like impoverished and disabled and ill. So I'm just kind of wondering how you all are looking at this in terms of that, and making sure that the most vulnerable, even in a community like mine, which, has a reputation for wealth, there's still people living in public housing and impoverished and all of that. And then we don't get designated as an EJ community, even though we have EJ households. And of course, you've got the whole McMansion issue going on. As you know, many people are building massive houses and their front yard is all driveway. So how are we addressing that issue as well? So those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
Ellen, wonderful questions. I can take a stab at responding. One of the issues you highlighting is really part of the genesis of this project, and that is that there is no legal responsibility for preventing flooding. Really, it's a real gap. So at the start, I was talking about water quality. There are lots of laws about water quality, and not, polluting our waterways, which of course are wonderful. It's not the same with flooding. It's very different. So it's, well, of course, generally speaking, I think governments don't want their residents to be flooded, whether it's a local government or a state government, don't want their residents to be flooded. The actual responsibility there, is not really directly put on in any specific way. So it's a real gap. Through these climate planning initiatives, it has been identified as a key issue for every community in our watershed. But adding to that problem is they don't control where all the water comes from. The water comes from upstream, the water comes from neighboring communities, and they have no control over that. So this is one reason we've really been leaning into looking at what other types of government structures or even policy moves might be necessary to just make that much more explicit. Hey, this regional entity is responsible for preventing flooding in this area, and that's their charge.
If I can just say one thing, I wasn't expecting preventing, I was expecting after 250 homes flooded, you have a responsibility to your community to help them. And part of the story in Needham was we had a problem with the flood basins that they have been avoiding for 20 plus years. And of course, what they did to solve it is now all of our water bills are thousands of dollars, and same thing in Newton, thousands of dollars more than they used to be. So for me, it was like the responsibility of like, there's a snowstorm, you plow the streets. There's a flood, you help your neighbors get the water out of the basin, is where I was thinking.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And we're, like I said, we're in our efforts, we are much more leaning into that prevention side, because then nobody has to deal with it. And not to say it'll never happen, but that's just, it's obviously the cheaper way to go and the safer way to go. The second part of your question about the climate vulnerable residents, and then maybe some of the kind of disparity or even misconception about resource availability across the watershed. That is also something very top of mind for us in our work. We've really been, as I highlighted in our goal slides, one of our priorities for flood protection has been areas that are defined as environmental justice or known to have climate vulnerable residents. Now, that will not, necessarily catch everyone in the watershed. We recently also completed, this is a separate project of the Charles River Climate Compact, but recently completed an equity plan. And one of the main pieces of that was to really understand climate vulnerability in our watershed, like go deeper than those state environmental justice designations, because they miss things and they aggregate things statewide, and a lot of that is different relative. And it is very true in our watershed that one of the challenges is real gap in resource availability across residents, very high earning residents, very high income residents, well-resourced residents, and then, those lower income as well. So there is real disparity And that does result in exactly what Ellen is describing. And so that is actually something we just wrapped up with the Climate Compact and are leaning into now. So it was just wonderful, timely point. Thank you for making that. Don't have answers, but definitely something we're considering.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Ellen. I'm gonna go to some questions we got in the chat before we get to you, Libby. One of the questions that we got, and I think this is specifically around, you know, solutions that we're modeling to see how it can reduce flooding, was around preserving and increasing tree canopy as a solution. I think the question was just, what about preserving and increasing tree canopy? I don't know if anyone from Weston Sampson want to take that.
Yeah, we, as part of thinking about these concepts as nature-based solutions, right? We are thinking about plantings when we zoom in to site-specific project level ideas. But what we're not doing yet is looking at holistically, right, at the tree canopy in the area, what its change has been, what its future looks like, and how much water it may or may not retain. So Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But we're not really at a place where we're integrating true urban forestry and forestry thoughts with flood reduction, but we are thinking about canopy when we're auguring into site-specific solutions. Like, we're not proposing to put flood strategies anywhere that it's, you know, that are what would I call it, like mature trees or valuable trees to keep, right? But invasive trees, right? What's that tree called? It's like the tree of heaven, you know what I'm talking about? Right? If there's those there, that's a spot we would say, let's use this for stormwater. Let's get rid of these invasives. So I hope that answers the question well enough. Julie or Indrani, please jump in if I didn't catch something. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that was great, Jenny. The only thing, as you touched upon it, but just to reinforce that, is that the types of strategies of green infrastructure that we're looking at can include tree planter boxes. You know, those do those do require a lot of maintenance. Sometimes the extent of canopy growth on them may not be as much as we would get from mature tree canopy coverage, but those do offer. If the tree planter boxes, if those are connected to infiltrating catch basins, that can double up the amount of storage that can be achieved in terms of rainfall capture, runoff capture, but it also has co-benefits of water quality and can provide to mitigate some of the urban heat island impacts.
Yeah, and I'll add that because there's another question that came through the chat around incentives to promote tree planting and questions around current trees that are in floodplains that might be suffering, and how we can manage that. So aside from this project with the Climate Compact, we are also concurrently doing a project around regional tree planting and protection. And within that project, we are looking at a regional scale around tree management, tree maintenance, and tree expansion for the watershed. And so that's another project that you can also find in at the CRWA website. I'll have one more question, technical question for Weston Sampson, and then we can get to Libby. Question was, how does the model take into account the existing permeability of the ground at the time of the storm? For example, if the ground is frozen versus not frozen, dry versus not frozen and already saturated, and does the model assume some average or typical permeability conditions?
Yes, that is an important question. Thank you for asking that. We are accounting for the antecedent moisture conditions. So when we have run the model, we have tested it with different antecedent moisture conditions, whether it's dry, especially for the storm of the March 10, 2010 storm that I mentioned. Some of you may remember that was an extensive period of rain that occurred over a period of 2 weeks in the month of March in 2010. That was accompanied by snowmelt. So when we actually calibrated our model to reflect that storm, we did factor in the wet conditions. We factored in the high groundwater conditions as well. So the model is developed in PC Swim, the proprietary model that we use to simulate the rainfall runoff is in PC Swim. And that has the ability to for the antecedent moisture conditions in the model to be changed. And we've done sensitivity analysis and have calibrated the model to those parameters.
Thank you, Indrani. Libby, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So, this has been a wonderful presentation, and I really, really, really appreciate the work that's been done on the Charles River flood model. It's absolutely fantastic, and really appreciate all the work that Weston and Sampson has put into this. I representing Trees for Watertown, in Watertown, we've been a little distressed to see projects proposed that have a lot of effort putting into meeting the Watertown model with no recognition of how important it is to preserve existing trees, nor even any. It's pretty clear that there's very little understanding of what trees do among engineers, among civil engineers, and the kind of people who are working as consultants to develop these stormwater management and retention models. And I have to admit, I was getting a little nervous in Weston and Sampson's presentation because the fact that trees do such an active job of excuse me, of managing stormwater. They don't just store it; they actually, pump it out of the ground and trans-evaporate it. So, I think this is perhaps more of a comment than anything that I'd really love to see in the community of engineers much better understanding, much more work done to understand and incorporate how important trees are in managing stormwater.
Libby, that's such an important statement. I mean, right there's that USDA quote, a tree can reduce over 4,000 gallons per year of stormwater runoff. And I think there's another one that's like, it can hold some bananas amount of water per storm, right? Like very mature trees are a significant part of our overall watershed management piece. My team has an arborist on it and landscape architects. And as we really do hone in on solutions, we are thinking about these pieces, but I agree with you, right? The practice isn't there yet. So I think as we're working through this with CRWA, we are thinking about tree canopy and how important it is, and bringing tree canopy back to our developed areas in ways that are possible given all the constraints with utility conflicts and ADA requirements and offsets and parking and all the mobility needs and bike lanes and all the things that compete for space in an urban sort of suburban space. But Libby, I'm so glad you said that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Libby. All right, another question that came through the chat. In terms of like our site specific or like priority sites or even impact areas, someone had a question on how do we get permission for and funding for the proposed projects like the one that was shown for Dedham and Norfolk. So I don't know if Julie, you want to start?
Yes, I would be
as well.
Yes, I would be happy to take that one. Sorry to jump on you there, Dira. So this is the design phase, just design phase of the work. We work in communities that are partners in the project. So we're engaging the DPW, the planner, whomever conservation, whoever town staff is available. We're engaging the town staff in the process, doing the planning. And then comes, sorry, my son is saying hi to everyone. And then comes the part where we go into permitting, and get funding. And so I'm excited to say, since the start of the project, we've now had about half of the sites we've identified get additional funding of some sort, for either for additional design or for full-on construction. So we really are moving these. A lot of times, the hardest part of the project is finding it and generating the initial idea. Like there can sometimes just be no money for that. So we've been able to do that efficiently by looking across a large area and finding a lot of projects and get this pipeline going. We last November also put in a $10 million grant request to the federal government for 5 more projects to go to construction. Definitely feeling not super optimistic about that at this point, especially after the news this week about no more federal funding. But that's essentially how it works. It's identify, work with residents and town officials to get the design, and then we help find funding and get full-on design and get permitting and go to construction. We have one project right now going to construction in Newton, if anybody's on from Newton. That's an underground storage tank, part of the Albemarle Field redevelopment that was identified in the very first phase of our work. So excited to see that going to construction.
Claire, did you want to add anything from a municipal perspective?
Yeah, I think Julie really hit the nail on the head that sometimes finding the project idea and having the science to back it up as a valid project concept to the grant funding sources can oftentimes be the hardest piece of the puzzle. Natick was identified as a project site in 2023, and we were able to secure MVP funding for our design phase in the current fiscal year. If folks are interested, maybe Dira, I'll throw the link in the chat to you, and maybe you can throw it in the chat for everybody. We'll be having a project meeting on February 12th about the project that was identified by the flood model here in Natick. And we're really excited to be working with Weston and Sampson to get those designs developed over the course of this fiscal year.
Okay, thanks, Claire. All right, we are just about to hit 8:30, but there's just one last question, and then I think we can go to our last slide. And this last question is also another technical question. Someone's curious about the impervious surface coverage in the model. Does the USGIS data, does it include information about residential properties like parcel data? Does it include driveways, paved backyards, or parking lots in apartment complexes?
Yes, it does. The latest version of the impervious cover data that we have used is based on the version of the data that is in the Massachusetts Mass Mapper, and I believe it's the 2022 impervious area coverage. Jenny's going to do a quick fact check on that, but that does account for residential impervious coverage on residential parcels. That includes driveways, building footprints as well. So that it is very high resolution. I think it goes down to sort of the pixels go down to probably a 3 feet resolution even. So it does go, it does capture the impervious cover at that residential scale as well.
Great, thank you, Indrani. All right, well, thank you everyone who stayed till the very end. Our contact information is on the slide, but as we close out our webinar, there will also be a survey pop-up. We would appreciate if folks can take the time to fill out the survey and share some of their thoughts and experiences with us as we continue into this phase of our project. And thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.